When I go to events, it always reminds me of when I was a young boy and the Baptist church my parents forced me to attend. Everybody wanted to sit at the back, except for the minister's wife, who was made to sit at the front, and the choir. Thank you so much for coming to this event, which is the fourth in a series of events around agricultural policy. The current Farm Bill legislation is set to expire on September 30th of next year, of 2018, and Congress is avidly discussing, at least within the agricultural committees, what a new Farm Bill should look like. And many other groups are concerned about the Farm Bill as well. AI has a 65-year tradition of providing information around the debates on the Farm Bill. And this event is focused very much on agricultural policy related issues associated with the Farm Bill and beyond that affect conservation and the environment. And in that vein, I'm really pleased to introduce our three speakers to you. I'll do the introductions all at once. And then each of our presenters will discuss their paper. And we'll hold Q&A questions until after the last speaker has spoken. I've given them a strict time limit of 18 minutes per person, so that should leave half an hour for Q&A. If you want to throw rocks, please don't. Just go to go to Jerusalem and throw rocks there, please. Apparently that's a big issue today. In fact, don't do that at all. That's not appropriate. Let me emphasize, extremely not appropriate. Dr. Lichtenberg, sitting to my direct right, is a fellow of the American Agricultural Economics Association. He's a professor of agricultural and resource economics at the University of Maryland, where he's been a faculty member since 1988. He has a genuine international reputation for his outstanding research program on conservation and environmental issues over the past 35 years. Our second speaker, who will be talking about the waters of the United States, is Dr. Nathan Hendricks. He is associate professor in the Department of Agricultural Economics at Kansas State University. His research examines how economic incentives affect agricultural production and the interaction between agriculture and the environment. Our final speaker today, who will be talking about the Renewable Fuel Standards, is Dr. Aaron Smith. You'll gather from his accent that Dr. Smith is originally from New Zealand. He is professor of agricultural and resource economics at the University of California, Davis, and he is an expert on agricultural and energy markets and agricultural and energy policy. So it's my genuine pleasure to introduce all three of these distinguished speakers to you. We're going to begin with Dr. Lichtenberg's examination of current conservation policy and potential changes in that policy. Dr. Lichtenberg.
Thank you, Vince. Thank you all. It's a pleasure to be here today. What I'm going to do is share some thoughts with you about the conservation title of the Farm Bill. So this is the section that deals with programs aimed at protecting farmland from erosion, preserving wildlife habitat, mitigating air and water pollution problems that emanate from agriculture, things like that. 65 years ago when this program started, there was no conservation title, and conservation itself was an afterthought in the Farm Bill. But increasingly, it is more and more central to the Farm Bill, as we'll see. Specifically, we're talking about programs like the Conservation Reserve Program, CRP, the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, EQIP, Conservation Stewardship Program, CSP, and others of that ilk. Now, I'm going to start by reminding myself and all of us of a phrase that one hears a lot in policy circles, that it's important always not to let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And I think that's a phrase that applies very much here. Conservation Reserve, EQIP, CSP, they are very far from being perfect. But right now, they are the main way that we deal with some very serious environmental problems nationwide. And while their current design limits the amount of good that they can actually accomplish, there are some relatively simple changes we could make that would let them accomplish a whole lot more. Do I have slides?
Let's press on the forward button.
Oh, okay. Sorry, a little bit behind here. Okay. Now, one source, sort of one fundamental source of those limitations is that from the very beginning of these kinds of programs, more than 80 years ago, conservation programs have had mixed goals. In particular, environmental quality and resource conservation goals have always been intertwined with income support. And that starts with the very first New Deal programs that brought these things into existence. And if we look historically, over time, the role of conservation waxes when times are hard down on the farm, and, until very recently, wanes when times are flush. More recently, though, conservation has assumed a larger and larger role in the universe of direct payments to farmers. You can sort of see from this graph that conservation spending grew in the early 2000s and has remained pretty steady, even in the face of budget cuts, even when other direct payments to farmers have been cut. And the result is that conservation accounts for a larger and larger share of the non-nutrition portion of Farm Bill authorized spending. So in the 2014 Farm Bill, for instance, if we take out nutrition, conservation was the second largest budget item. Okay, only second to crop insurance and ahead of traditional commodity programs. Okay. Same time, there has been a trend within conservation spending away from paid land diversion and towards payments for conservation on working farmland. So you can see that from the bar graph on the left, that the role of the Conservation Reserve Program has been shrinking over time as a share of conservation payments, whereas EQIP and CSP have been growing as a share. Now, the more cynical among us might surmise that income support for active farmers has something to do with this, just as it has been historically. Unlike the 1930s, we have the WTO to contend with, and the WTO limits farm support payments generally, okay, payments for farm income support, but it does not place limits on payments for conservation, because those are presumed to be for environmental quality and non-distortionary. So, again, the more cynical among us might say, well, this is a good way to get money to farmers that evades WTO restrictions. Even the more cynical among us ought to recognize that there are really valid economic reasons for conservation subsidies. These have changed over time. Traditionally, the big rationale was to give farmers sufficient incentives to invest in preventing soil erosion, and in cases where they had those incentives but lacked the finance, to give them the financial capacity to do that. That's a rationale that no longer really has a whole lot of traction. We know that land and capital markets that function as well as the ones we have here in the U.S. today give farmers plenty of incentive to invest in soils. In fact, possibly even overinvest in erosion control and soil quality generally. And of course, if finance is the stumbling block, then we ought to be lending farmers money and not paying them. But it's been recognized more and more since the 1960s that conservation measures can mitigate environmental damage that's caused by farming. Water quality impairments, loss of wildlife habitat, threats to endangered species, air pollution, things like this. And these are all cases where unregulated markets do a very poor job of providing adequate levels of services. I would argue, in fact, that the greatest of these is probably water quality, because water quality problems are so pervasive in this country and because agriculture is such a large contributor to them. For instance, nitrogen and phosphorus from farms account for an estimated 70% of the nutrients that are causing dead zones in the Gulf of Mexico, and an estimated 40 to 50% of water quality problems here in the Chesapeake Bay. The big problem historically with these agricultural contributions to environmental damage is that those contributions are largely non-point source, which means that we really can't just regulate them using traditional end-of-pipe means or anything similar to that. And that's led EPA to give agriculture a pass most of the time on regulation, at least up until right now. We also know from economic theory that for industries that are as diverse and heterogeneous as agriculture is, incentive-based policies like subsidies are actually more efficient than traditional forms of regulation. So we have some good sort of economic theory reasons for thinking that subsidies for conservation might do a good job in dealing with environmental problems from agriculture. We know also from economic theory that voluntary subsidy programs, like those that we have, can have some significant problems of implementation. They can pay farmers to implement practices that they would have been profitable to do anyway. So essentially, we're getting, in some cases, less than we pay for. This is the problem of imperfect additionality. They can create incentives for farmers to expand production onto new kinds of land. That kind of expansion of production will create an offset in any pollution reduction. That's the problem of slippage or leakage. And they can pay farmers more than the minimum amount needed, really, to get farmers to do what we want them to do. That said, voluntary conservation programs are still better than nothing, which is the alternative. But how much better? Okay, so the question is, how much more environmental improvement do we get from paid land diversion through the CRP? How much do we get from subsidies on working farmland through EQIP and CSP and things like that? Let me start with the CRP. Now, CRP is administered on a national basis. It uses a reverse auction mechanism. Farmers offer parcels of land for enrollment, and they name the price they want, and USDA selects which parcels to enroll from the parcels that are offered. When the CRP was first implemented back in the late 1980s, enrollments were criticized very heavily for getting far too little in the way of environmental quality improvements for the amounts of money that was being spent. Some simulation studies by Mark Robato of the Economic Research Service of USDA in particular showed very strikingly how much more value we could have gotten from existing CRP budgets simply by reorienting CRP enrollment toward water quality improvements that affected heavily populated areas. Now, to its credit, USDA responded to these criticisms by creating a formula to be used to quantify environmental benefits in a uniform way across the whole country. And it now requires that all bids for enrolling land in the CRP be scored using that Environmental Benefits Index, or EBI. Using the EBI to score bids has made some difference in the geographic distribution of enrollment, but not really all that much. You can see from the graph here, which plots enrollment by state in 2016 against enrollment in 1990 with a 45-degree line for comparison. Things look pretty much the same today as they did back in 1990. And if we look at a map, we can see exactly why. You can see that CRP enrollment remains concentrated in portions of the plain states that are sparsely populated, that contribute very little to water quality or other general environmental improvements. They are, however, subject to wind erosion, and they have land that qualifies as highly erodible, even though the aggregate environmental benefits from them are not all that large. Okay, comparing the two maps, you can just see that the heavy enrollment areas for the CRP map very closely onto the high wind erosion portions in the right-hand side map. So how does this happen? Well, the answer is that the EBI is constructed to do that. The most notable fact is that wildlife habitat and recreational hunting account for the majority of the EBI in enrolled parcels. And when we talk about wildlife habitat, we are really not talking about endangered species. We're talking about prairie potholes. We're talking about duck and pheasant hunting. I don't know about out there, but around here, farmers lease out their land after the harvest for that kind of recreation. Another factor is that the EBI looks at each parcel in isolation, so that things that we would think of as important determinants of benefits, like how many people are affected by any environmental quality improvement, that doesn't matter. It's just, do you have this on your parcel or not? Not how many people benefit or suffer damage. There are also other technical points that boost the importance of wind erosion potential compared to water erosion potential. And calculating cost relative to a cap accentuates the importance of land that's cheap. Now, things are different when it comes to conservation on working farmland. Here, as has been the case from the beginning, funds for these programs are allocated to states by formula. States allocate their funds then to counties, and funding decisions within each county are made by committees that are elected by and from farm businesses in that county. Proposals for conservation projects have to be approved by NRCS technicians before they're eligible for funding. But aside from ensuring that proposals meet eligibility criteria, and aside from auditing expenditures to make sure there's no self-dealing going on, USDA does actually not exercise authority over spending decisions. Once again, the formulas for allocating EQIP and CSP funds to each state are complicated weighted sums of a couple of dozen different factors. But most of those factors boil down to one question: how much farming do you have in your state? If you've got a lot, you get a lot of money. If you don't have a lot, you don't get a lot of money. And you can see from these charts, each state's share of EQIP funding corresponds closely to its share of farm operations in the country. Each state's share of CSP funding tracks its share of farmland. What that means is that environmental quality problems don't really play a large role in determining where EQIP and CSP money is spent, and that's by design. Okay. Now, I've mentioned that voluntary subsidy programs are subject to problems of implementation. How big are they? Well, that's hard to estimate because we don't know what the world would look like if everything else was the same except for the existence of these programs. You know, we can't play the multiple universe game, peep through wormholes and look at those alternative universes like that and then come back and report. So we have to use econometric methods to construct counterfactuals. There's not a whole lot of evidence to date. There's not a lot of econometric studies to date. The ones that do suggest that additionality is pretty high, but far from perfect. And they do show that there is potential for significant slippage or leakage. Okay. These studies really can't be definitive. They account for too small a share of the nation's agriculture, and they're very dependent on the time and place they were estimated. but they are suggestive that there is room for improvement in implementation. But I think the main area to look for improvement is simply by changing the formulas that are used to allocate funding. It seems to me that we could get a lot more in the way of environmental benefits from the rather simple expedient of forcing USDA to allocate money using metrics that place most of their weight on environmental benefits as we economists typically think of them, in particular weighted by the affected population rather than sort of considered in isolation at the parcel level. That's something you can do administratively for the CRP. For EQIP and CSP, you have to change the law because the allocation of funding is actually written into the law. Now, politically, that's challenging because reorienting conservation spending that way is going to take money away from legislative districts where farming interests have a lot of clout and sending it to legislative districts where they don't. Okay? But because it's difficult, there's no reason not to think that it's worth doing. So once again, in the interest of not letting the perfect be the enemy of the good, for all of their imperfections, conservation programs in the Farm Bill play an important role in dealing with environmental problems in agriculture. These are worthwhile programs, and they're programs whose benefits, I think, can be increased in relatively simple ways given the political will to do so. And I very much hope that we can find that political will. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next paper is presented by Nathan Hendricks, and it's on a non-controversial subject called the Waters of the United States Rule.
All right. Thanks, Vince. So the Clean Water Act gives the EPA and the Army Corps of Engineers authority to regulate water quality over navigable waters. What's clear is that the jurisdiction, the agency's jurisdiction, extends beyond navigable waters in order to protect the quality of navigable waters. What is unclear is exactly how far that jurisdiction should reasonably extend to. And in June 2015, the EPA finalized a clean water rule, which defines the waters of the U.S., or WOTUS, and defining some rules about how far that jurisdiction extends. Immediately, lawsuits followed, and by October of 2015, a nationwide stay was placed on the rule and is still in place. So the issue with WOTUS, what's important to keep in mind is this is really a jurisdictional issue. How far does the jurisdiction of EPA and the Army Corps of Engineers extend over what land and over what waters are under the jurisdiction of the Clean Water Act? And there's been several Supreme Court cases that have created some uncertainty and have helped to define this a little bit, but there's still a lot of uncertainty exactly how it should be, what the jurisdiction should be. And the most recent court case was 2006, and it was the majority decision was that the EPA had overreached their jurisdiction, but there was two separate opinions written in that 2006 court case, and Justice Scalia wrote the majority opinion, and he argued that the jurisdiction should extend to those waters that have a continuous surface connection with navigable waters. So a fairly limited jurisdictional definition. Justice Kennedy sided with the majority in their decision that the EPA had overextended the reach, but he wrote a different opinion, and his opinion wrote that the jurisdiction should extend to any area that has a significant nexus to navigable waters. And that language is really key, significant nexus. And the 2015 WOTUS rule that was written uses the Kennedy test of this significant nexus. Then in February of 2017, this year, President Trump signed an executive order that had the EPA, ordered the EPA to review the definition of waters of the U.S. and asked the agencies to consider making a new rule that would use the Scalia test of a a more narrow jurisdiction. Clearly, the Kennedy test of significant nexus would have a much broader jurisdictional definition with that. So now I just want to talk a little bit about the Clean Water Act, in particular how it applies to agriculture and the sections as they relate to agriculture. So 3 important sections. Section 402 is the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System. Confined animal feeding operations, or CAFOs, are regulated under Section 402. They are defined as a point source, and so they do have to obtain permits for emissions from confined animal feeding operations if those emissions are into waters of the U.S. But non-point emissions from agriculture, those emissions that are not from a pipe, and so that would be pretty much all of crop production, livestock production that would not be in confined animal feeding operations, those are exempt from permitting requirements. All those activities are exempt from permitting requirements in Section 402. Then Section 404 is the permit program for dredged or fill material that the Army Corps of Engineers implements, and there the exemption for agriculture is for normal farming activity. So what the EPA and the Corps have said does not constitute normal farming activity is a conversion of a wetland. So if there's an area that's deemed as a waters of the U.S. that's a wetland that has not previously been in crop production, and a farming activity would convert that into crop production, that would not be deemed normal farming activity, and so that would need to go through the permit process of this. But if land has been in continuous crop production, normal farming activity, plowing that land, other normal types of activity would all be exempt from permit requirements, even if it was WOTUS. And then there is Section 303, which allows states to establish total maximum daily loads. So states will look at the water quality of different water bodies, and if they determine that a water body is impaired, then they can establish a total maximum daily load, which would determine how much pollutants can be going into that water body. And then the states, again, not the EPA, but the states would define an implementation plan of how to achieve that total maximum daily load. Here, agriculture, there is no exemption for agriculture. It's up to the states and how they would choose to implement that total maximum daily load. So states could choose to, if there were non-point emissions that were a major contributor to the water quality problem, states could choose to pay farmers to change their management practices, or states could choose to implement some regulation to require farmers to change their management practices. There's no exemption here for non-point source pollution in Section 303. So the consequences of the WOTUS rule, I would argue there's 2 main consequences. The first is a lot of regulatory uncertainty. And the source of that regulatory uncertainty under the 2015 WOTUS rule is that the jurisdiction used this significant nexus definition, which leaves a lot of the jurisdiction of under a case-by-case determination. So a lot of the jurisdiction cannot be said a priori whether your land is under the jurisdiction, and so you would need to, if you wanted to know if your land had waters of the U.S. on it, you would need to go through a process called the jurisdictional determination from the Army Corps of Engineers to determine whether or not you have WOTUS and would need a permit for non-exempt activities. And the fines for violations are very stiff under the Clean Water Act. So the fines for inadvertent violations are $25,000 per day. So that is, even if a person did not know that their land had waters of the U.S. and they did not obtain a permit for non-exempt activities, they would still face fines of $25,000 per day of violations. So that clearly gives a pretty strong incentive to that creates a lot of uncertainty in whether your activities need a permit or not, and so there's a strong incentive to do these jurisdictional determinations to try to protect landowners. And then if the jurisdictional determination would indicate that you have waters of the U.S. on your land. Then you need to obtain a permit for non-exempt activities, and the cost of those permits is very large as well. So this is the one study finds that the average cost of a general permit, which is what would most likely apply to most agricultural activities, is about $30,000 for a permit, and on average takes about 313 days to acquire that permit. Other activities that would require an individual permit, which have more significant impacts on water, the permits for those can cost up to $271,000 and take 788 days on average to obtain those. And then the second thing, I think, a consequence of the WOTUS rule is that there's not a lot of improvement. There's little improvement in water quality that's evident through the expanded jurisdiction under the 2015 WOTUS rule. And a key reason for that is non-point emissions are still exempt under the WOTUS rule. So it does nothing to change the exemptions for agricultural activity. And as mentioned earlier, a lot of the emissions are from non-point sources. So problems of water quality of nutrients in the water, a lot of that is from non-point sources, and those would still be, those activities would still be exempt under the WOTUS rule. And in general, the EPA had difficulty documenting the benefits from the expanded jurisdiction, and this is just a table, a key table out of their economic analysis of the impacts of the expanded jurisdiction. And so the left, you have the costs, their projected annual costs from the expanded jurisdiction and the annual benefits. And the thing that I want to focus on in particular is the benefits from Section 404 for the wetlands permits, where they estimate the annual benefits are at $306 million per year for wetlands protection. So essentially this is, this Section 404 is saying this would have fewer wetlands would be converted out of, would be lost. And so the benefits of not losing those wetlands, they estimate at $306 million per year. If you dig in that a little more, here's their table of how much wetlands would be protected in each region and their estimated benefits of each region. And again, I'll focus in on one region, the Midwest, for example. And you can see those acres categories gives the acres of wetlands that would be protected under the expanded jurisdiction that they project would be protected. So that comes out to about, if you add those two together, you've got about 177 acres of wetlands that would not have been lost under the expanded jurisdiction. And so that's an area that's about a half mile by half mile. And they estimate that the annual benefits of protecting that half mile by half mile wetlands are $114 million annually, which would come down to about $645,000 per acre annually. And so the estimated benefits here seem overly inflated, certainly. Again, this is the cost-benefit analysis of the 2015 WOTUS rule of expanding the jurisdiction. And I would argue that the real issue in water quality, or a key problem that we have, is we don't have markets for water quality. And one of the reasons for that is a lack of secure property rights. And what I mean by the property rights here is the property rights for non-point emissions. So if agriculture has the property right to emit non-point emissions, then a market could form where environmental interests could either pay farmers to change their practices to reduce their emissions, or environmental interests could pay to treat the water, whatever is the least cost method of improving water quality. Or if we reverse the property rights such that society has the right to pollutants below a certain level in the water, then agriculture interests would either have to incur the cost of implementing practices that would improve water quality, or agricultural interests could pay others to treat the water, or pay to go over the defined allocation, could pay environmental interests for that. But a key problem, I would argue, in those markets forming is that we don't have secure property rights. And the reason for that is pretty vague language in the Clean Water Act. So for those exemptions for non-point emissions, again, the exemption for normal farming activity obviously is open to some interpretation. And Section 303, certainly the total maximum daily loads, agriculture does not have a property right under Section 303. So it's unclear for sure how the property rights extend exactly for non-point emissions. And so this creates a case where of those that want to improve, environmental interests that want to improve water quality, face a decision. If they want to improve water quality, they can either pay lawyers and lobbyists to try to change that property right or try to reinterpret some of the language in the Clean Water Act to regulate agricultural practices, or environmental interests could pay to improve water quality. And they'll choose which route they feel like they could improve water quality at the least cost method. But unfortunately, I would argue we've had a bit too much of the legal challenges on the language, because the language of the Clean Water Act is unnecessarily vague. And so we haven't had these markets form due to the insecure property rights. Some advantages of market solutions for water quality is, one, they better determine the least cost method of improving water quality. So if entrepreneurial landowners can find new ways to improve water quality, they can determine which practices are best going to improve water quality. And environmental interests, if they're paying for water quality and they have an interest in seeing improvements in that water quality, they'll do a better job of targeting where should the payments go, for what practices, who should receive them. They have an incentive through the market for water quality to see those improvements happen. And so they're better at doing that rather than the government trying to decide which practices improve water quality, and they're targeting. Obviously, we've heard some of the problems with those, and markets do a better job of determining the least cost method of achieving that, and also create an incentive to innovate and find new, unique solutions to water quality problems. And second, markets optimally evaluate costs and benefits. Obviously, a key challenge is how much improvement in water quality should we attain? Well, if environmental interests are paying farmers to change their practices to reduce nutrient loads, then environmental interests will keep paying farmers to change their practices as long as the benefits they're getting in water quality exceed the costs and what they're paying farmers to implement that. And so they'll keep paying as long as that cost-benefit analysis works out. And so markets are better optimally evaluating those costs and benefits. I think there are some things we could do that would encourage market solutions for water quality. First is clearly defining the property rights. And so that's the key thing I've already talked about, where that's insecure due to vague language right now. A second is reducing transaction costs. That is the cost of a group making a transaction to improve water quality. And I think a few things that could be done here. One is there might be some local institutions that need to be developed in order to reduce those transaction costs. So, for example, if recreational users of water want to pay farmers to change practices, that would be very difficult for an individual recreational user to make a deal with farmers, but there could be an institution that represents the collective interests of recreational users that institution could make payments to farmers for changes in practices. So some of those institutions, and obviously the government providing enforcement of the contracts that are made under the market. And then third, I think there's certainly a rationale for financial incentives for the government to provide. If the contributions to improvement for water quality were purely voluntary, then you're going to have a free riding problem, right? One individual says, I'll just let my neighbor pay for improved water quality and I'm going to free ride on their contributions. And so there's certainly an economic rationale for using taxpayer dollars and creating some financial incentives for this. But I think perhaps a more effective way to do that, rather than paying farmers directly, is to provide that money through environmental interests, and then the environmental interests can use a market to improve water quality. Key reason I think that an improvement in that is that the environmental interests have an interest in seeing improvements in water quality. So they'll determine how best to allocate that money, whether that is how to target the money, who to pay, which practices, and so they naturally have an incentive to see those improvements if the money's going through them rather than directly from the government. And in conclusion, so the WOTUS rule, I'd argue, creates a lot of regulatory uncertainty with little improvements in water quality, and there's a need to pursue innovative policies that can encourage markets for cost-effective improvements in water quality.
Nathan, thank you so much. Our two speakers have all kept to their allotted time span of 18 minutes, which I find impressive, by the way. We're all professors, and we like to speak a lot. Our third speaker, Dr. Aaron Smith, is going to discuss an even less controversial topic, the Renewable Fuel Standards. And we're really pleased that Nathan, who took a red eye to get here, Aaron, who took a red eye. Nathan slept in a bed last night. Aaron did not. Dr. Smith did not. And so we really appreciate him being here, and we look forward to what you have to say, Aaron.
All right. Thank you, Vince. So the Renewable Fuel Standard is a piece of legislation passed in 2007 that requires certain quantities of biofuel to be blended into our transportation fuel supply each year. That legislation was passed 10 years ago, and what I want to try to do today is to go through three lessons that I think we can draw from 10 years of the Renewable Fuel Standard. The first of those lessons is that I think policymakers and policy analysts need to be much more serious about incorporating uncertainty. That means incorporating uncertainty into policy. That means incorporating uncertainty, making policies that are robust to surprises, to shocks. For policy analysts, the same thing. Rather than trying to predict what we think will happen and basing all of our analysis on that one projection, trying to project instead the things that could happen and designing policy and doing our analysis based on that basis. That's lesson number one. Lesson number two, I think it's self-defeating to give the regulator too much discretion. And item number three is it's inefficient to mandate things that are prohibitively expensive or that don't yet exist. So some background on the RFS. When President George W. Bush signed the RFS into law, he highlighted two goals for the policy. The first of these goals was to reduce greenhouse gas emissions with the goal of mitigating climate change. The second objective was to reduce the dependence on foreign oil by increasing domestic production of liquid fuels. An additional effect of the policy has been to raise the demand for corn and other farm products. That increase in demand raises the prices and therefore raises the returns to farmers and landowners of cropland. The way that the mandate is structured, it has this complicated nesting structure where if you start at the bottom, there's a certain required amount each year of the cleanest fuels, which are cellulosic biofuels. These are biofuels that are made from the inedible parts of plants. So think grasses, think corn stover, maybe trees, other things that are non-edible. These products are projected to have the largest greenhouse gas effect. Okay, so by that I mean the biggest reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. So the legislation says we need at least some of that stuff. Then there's another component that is allowed to be less clean than the cellulosic, but still cleaner than corn ethanol. That's known as advanced biofuel. Things that fit into advanced biofuels include biodiesel, include ethanol made from sugarcane. The remainder of the mandate can be met with ethanol made from corn. The magnitudes of the required biofuel amounts were slated in the legislation to increase year by year. What you can see from this figure is up until about 2012, almost all of the mandate could be filled with corn ethanol. So conventional biofuel here, the yellow bars, that's ethanol made from corn. Corn ethanol was slated in the legislation to cap out in 2015 at 15 billion gallons per year. At the time, that was projected to be a little bit less than 10% of all transportation fuel. Starting in about 2012, the advanced biofuels were slated to take an increasing component of the mandate. And in particular, if you see the green bars there, by the time we get to 2022, the statute says that cellulosic biofuels should constitute almost half of the mandated fuels under this policy, and by themselves, about 10% of transportation fuel. So you add these two pieces together. At the time this legislation was written in 2007, we were projecting to have a quarter of our transportation fuel supply to be coming from biofuels, almost half of it from the piece that gives the biggest greenhouse gas emissions reduction, that being the cellulosic biofuels. Now, when we think about climate policy, economists are a little bit like a broken record. So one thing that economists will say is if what we want to do is to mitigate the effects of climate change, what we really want is we want a global carbon tax or a global cap and trade program. The reason that we think about a carbon tax is it has two particular incentives, two particular effects. First, by placing a tax on fossil fuels, we raise the price of fossil fuels, which creates a conservation incentive. People are going to use less of fossil fuels if you make them more expensive. The other effect is that if you make fossil fuels more expensive, you make renewables more competitive, right? They can be higher priced and still potentially competitive because you've placed a tax on the fossil fuel. Renewable fuel mandates are costly and expensive because they don't have the conservation incentive associated with them. They don't do anything to raise the price of the fossil fuels. They just purely try to subsidize the replacement fuel. So I'm not going to reiterate this message today. Okay, it's right, and I agree with it. Item number 2, addition there is research and development subsidies. Again, you can make good economic arguments that private industry may not invest as much as society would like into research and development of new technologies, and that there's a role for the public sector to finance that that investment. These are both things that are correct, that are right. What I'm going to do is, rather than reiterate those, to focus more on the details of the implementation of policy, and in particular here, this policy. The Renewable Fuel Standard is currently, and has been for the last couple of years, I would say, in flux. The first reason that the RFS has reached these crossroads is because we've hit what's known as the bland wall. Now, it's turned out to be relatively easy for us to use biofuel, in particular ethanol, up to 10% of the gasoline pool. Once you go above 10%, you require a whole bunch more infrastructure in terms of fueling infrastructure, in terms of types of cars and characteristics of vehicles, that it gets really expensive. You can see that in this graph. The black line is the bland wall. That's 10% of gasoline consumption each year up until 2016, and then projections of where that bland wall is likely to be through until 2022. The red line is the amount of ethanol we have used in the United States. And what you can see is when we got up to 10% in 2010, we have stayed there. We've essentially not breached the bland wall over the last 6 years. So that's prima facie evidence. The bland wall is costly. It's a barrier. The problem is that the RFS requires us, beginning in about 2012, 2013, to go above the bland wall. So we're required to use biofuels at levels that are greater than 10% of gasoline. And so this has created an irresistible force, immovable object kind of a problem, is what do we do? How do we deal with the fact that on the one hand, industry says it's way too expensive to include more biofuel. On the other hand, you have a policy that says that we must. The second problem that has come with the mandate is that the cellulosic production has not met the mandated levels. So we've essentially got zero cellulosic biofuel production even today, and so what we've ended up having is not the mandated levels of biofuel use, but instead the levels that are shown there in this picture, where we have essentially zero cellulosic until now, and no real signs that that's going to increase anytime soon. And we've had this difficulty of trying to get past the bland wall, because even if you write the cellulosic all the way down to zero, the mandate still requires biofuel use that is above the blend wall level. One big implication of this is that the climate change benefits of the Renewable Fuel Standard have been far short of expectations because the component of the RFS that was supposed to deliver the climate benefits hasn't materialized. We haven't gotten the cellulosic production that potentially promised so much in terms of climate change mitigation. So what can we learn from this experience over these 10 years? The first thing is, you might ask, is shouldn't regulators, and in particular I'm thinking about the EPA, which implements this policy, but Congress more generally, shouldn't they have seen the blend wall coming? Well, one answer to that question is to say, where did we think the blend wall was going to be in 2006? The dashed line there shows projections from the Energy Information Administration of where the blend wall would be projecting out to 2022. And what you notice is that that dashed line is above the yellow. It's above the conventional ethanol mandate. So what this says is, based on that 2006 projection, we would have been able to use the mandated 15 billion gallons of corn ethanol and still be inside the blend wall. Then what we got is 5 years of $100 oil. And what 5 years of $100 oil did was reduce gasoline consumption. And if you reduce gasoline consumption, you also lower the amount of gallons that makes up 10% of that gasoline consumption. You end up with the solid black line that is lower and is in fact below the blend wall. So this is a case of where we weren't really thinking about uncertainty. We were setting up a policy with 15 billion gallons thinking that was going to be under the blend wall, and it turned out that it wasn't. Another place where we can see that uncertainty wasn't taken into account was the EPA in 2009, as it was required to do in the statute, released a regulatory impact analysis. And this document is more than 1,000 pages. It includes tables and tables of projections and lots of details, and clearly was the product of a lot of work. However, the two things that have put the Renewable Fuel Standard at a crossroads received very little attention in that RIA. Okay. The blend wall and the delays in cellulosic production. What that means is that the projected benefits that the EPA projected, that were the product of this really big report, haven't materialized. If you look at the net benefits there in that table, the EPA projected fuel cost savings in 2022 of $12 billion, $11.8 billion. That came because they were projecting that gasoline prices were going to be $3.40 a gallon, that ethanol prices were going to be half that. And if ethanol costs half the price of gasoline, then using more ethanol will save you money. But it turns out that's not what we've seen. What we've seen is that gasoline and ethanol prices have been relatively close together and gone up and down together. So we haven't seen those fuel cost savings. The other projected savings or projected benefits that were to come out of this policy, according to the RIA, were the greenhouse gas emissions reductions. And again, they had a range of values there depending on what the social cost of carbon is, but we haven't received those benefits because we haven't gotten the cellulosic production. So the first lesson that I want to draw here is to really think about uncertainty, and I think this is something we want to think about more broadly than just in the context of the Renewable Fuel Standard. The regulatory impact analysis underemphasized uncertainty in relative prices of the two fuels. They just had a single projection or a very narrow range of projections. Uncertainty about how quickly this new cellulosic technology was going to develop. Uncertainty about fuel demand, so where is the blend wall going to be? And the costs of breaching that blend wall. So what we, I think, need to think about as analysts and as policymakers or those who are looking to influence policy is to realize that we don't know lots of things about the future. And we want to set up policies that are robust to what might happen. We don't know what the dominant transportation technology will be in the year 2050, so maybe we don't want to pick a particular winner, or at least to cut off paths that might lead us in a less costly direction. We don't know what relative prices are going to be like in the future. We don't know what the impact of climate change is going to be either. There's a very wide range of estimates ranging from relatively moderate to very severe, both in the United States and around the world. So thinking about uncertainty, I think, is very important as we evaluate policy. Lesson number 2, don't give the regulator too much discretion. In the statute, it says that by November 30th of each year, the EPA is required to do these 4 things. Number 1, get a forecast of next year's gasoline and diesel fuel consumption from the Department of Energy. Then look up the legislation and see how much is the mandated biofuel volumes. Divide one by the other. That gives you a ratio. And then require that the obligated parties, which are mostly oil refiners, show evidence that at least pi gallons of biofuel are sold for each gallon of petroleum fuel. So this seems like a very simple list of instructions that the EPA can follow each year. However, the statute also says that EPA may choose to lower the mandated standards if it would severely harm the economy or environment, or if there is inadequate domestic supply. Right? And these 2 features, these 2 potential get-out-of-jail cards have created a lot of havoc in the rulemaking process for the Renewable Fuel Standard. What you can see here is that this table tells us the timing of when things have happened over time. And if you look at the very bottom, you look at this year, for next compliance year, 2018, EPA released the final standards just a couple of weeks ago, November 30th, and they had proposed a rule in July of this year. And that's how it was supposed to work, according to the statute. But if you move up the table, what you see is that the standard for 2013 was released when the year was almost 2/3 over, not until August. The standard for 2014 wasn't actually finalized until the end of 2015. Similarly, the standard for 2015 wasn't finalized until the end of 2015. And this was largely because in 2013, when we hit the blend wall, the EPA faced a lot of pressure from fuel industry saying we cannot use this much ethanol, from the ethanol industry saying the law says you have to use our product, and this kind of lobbying pressure back and forth kind of led to a stalemate where nothing happened, and participants in the market were left with a lot of uncertainty about what's really going to happen with this policy. In addition, the EPA has received petitions to waive the mandate on the severe economic harm provision. In 2012, when we had the drought in the Midwest, was one. And then more recently, a petition from Texas claiming that costs of compliance are too high and that's severely causing economic harm. So another way that we can see the effects of this regulatory uncertainty and difficulty that the EPA has found itself in, where it's being barraged from all sides and lawsuits threatened left and right, and it can't make a decision, is to look at what is the marginal cost of compliance with this policy. The way this policy is implemented is through these renewable identification numbers, which is a credit. So what you want to think about this is if I'm a company that is blending biofuel into petroleum, then every time I blend in a gallon of biofuel, I generate one of these credits. And a certain number of these credits have to be turned into the EPA each year to show that the policy is being satisfied, that the mandate is being met. And so what I could potentially do as a blender, if I say it's too expensive for me to blend biofuel, instead I'm going to buy one of these credits from someone else and turn that in instead, then I'm doing a comparison. I'm saying, how much does it cost me to comply? How much does it cost me to buy a credit? And so the price of those credits is going to tell us what the marginal cost of compliance is. And what we see is when the blend wall hit in 2013, the compliance cost jumped way up to over $1.40 per gallon. And then it's fluctuated a whole bunch since then. And if you look at those red arrows show us the big moves in the price of RINs. Those big moves all happened on EPA announcements, where EPA would say, we're going to back off on what the statute says. Okay, RIN prices go way down. They say, no, we're going to actually enforce it. RIN prices go way up. So this is another indication that there's been a lot of compliance cost uncertainty in the market, in part because EPA has this discretion and is trying to figure out how to use it. And now I'm going to try to go to the next slide. And I'm going to be unsuccessful doing that. Lesson number 3 is the next thing that I'm going to talk about. And lesson number 3 try again. All right, excuse me. I at least have it in front of me. So lesson number 3 is to not mandate something that doesn't exist. Okay, here we go. So lesson number 2, in summary, what we've seen is a lot of regulatory uncertainty coming because EPA faces this discretion to change the mandates and has been paralyzed about what to do. The next thing is lesson number 3, which is the provision to not mandate something that doesn't exist. The cellulosic mandate was ambitious, okay? So the cellulosic mandate stated that we needed to go from essentially zero production of cellulosic biofuel up to as much as 10% of the liquid fuel supply by the year 2022. Initially, there was a lot of investment, both from government entities and from private firms, in developing these technologies. Private industry realized very quickly that this wasn't going to pay off and backed off. And so what we've seen is that this idea, this sort of regulate it or require it and it will come kind of idea, hasn't paid off. And one way to see why that might not be true is if we think about this compliance mechanism, the renewable identification numbers that I talked about. The RINs say that if I spend a bunch of money now to develop this new cellulosic technology, then I can potentially produce that technology, that fuel, using my technology, and I can sell it, and I can sell it at a premium and essentially recoup back the costs from the RINs. And what's going to happen, and what we see instead, is that once a new technology is developed, then inadequacies of patent law and other things mean that people can copy that technology, and that technology becomes cheap, and so you never get that recouping of the benefit that is mandated under the policy. So the cellulosic mandate was ambitious. It hasn't worked. And I think if we just step back and think, if the objective is to develop new technologies that are going to potentially be much cleaner of uses of liquid fuels, then maybe we should fund that directly rather than indirectly through the mandate. So I'm just going to conclude here now. This is still not responding. Is someone moving this? I don't know if I'm moving it or if someone else is moving it. In summary, the Renewable Fuel Standard has failed as a climate policy. We've gotten a lot of corn ethanol, which has small, if any, benefits to the climate. We haven't gotten the stuff that's supposed to give the biggest climate benefits. What we can learn from this policy, I think, is that the 3 lessons that I've outlined, incorporating uncertainty is important, not giving the regulator too much discretion is important, don't mandate things that don't exist is important, and in particular in the context of the Renewable Fuel Standard, there are some things that we could have done differently that would have helped and that we can see through the lens of these 3 lessons. Setting it as a rate standard would have helped much more with the blend wall issue if we said the required biofuel amounts each year are not a certain number of gallons, but instead a certain percentage of the fuel supply. Setting up the legislation that way would have removed this compliance cost uncertainty, would have made very transparent the idea that we are, when we're going to hit the blend wall and when we're potentially going to go through it. I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much.
Well, let's thank all 3 speakers. We're looking forward to getting your questions and having the panel answer those questions. This is a live event. It's being live streamed. So if you have a question, please wait for a microphone before you ask the question. And we would request that if you're willing, let us know who you are and where you're from. And also, above all, ask a question, if you would. And just as a quick comment, in all 3 areas, it seems like a movie and a play apply simultaneously. That is the Field of Dreams that Dr. Smith hinted at, and Thomas Beckett's, not Thomas, but Beckett's Interminable Waiting for Godot play. We seem to wait forever to get better policy. With that, let me open up for questions. Boy, you stunned them. So if you all don't have questions, then I have to start asking questions. And so the question for Dr. Dr. Lichtenberg is this. Should we subsidize farmers to generate environmental improvements, or should we tax them when they carry out practices that generate pollution?
In general, taxes work better than subsidies in cases like this. We have known since the 1970s that taxes and subsidies work slightly differently in the long run, right? Taxes basically create incentives for industries to shrink. Subsidies create incentives for industries to expand. And so subsidies have the problem of slippage or leakage that I referred to. That's really the equivalent of industry expansion. And so taxing farmers for the pollution they generate is a more efficient policy than subsidizing them to adopt practices that would reduce any environmental damage they cause. The complication is that we don't know exactly how much environmental damage most farmers cause, because most farmers are not point sources. They're not large confined animal feeding operations. They don't have to get permits to discharge into the water. Instead, what's happening is that nutrients that are left over after the growing season are going to make their way through the water table, make it into streams, cause nutrient pollution. Now, how much is going to vary from year to year. It's going to vary from place to place because there's a lot that goes on between the time something is entering into the water table and the time it reaches a stream. That means we're going to have to impute. Now, Nathan referred to TMDL regulation. We do have this on tap for the Chesapeake Bay region, and it will cover agriculture. And I believe there will be baselines that agriculture will be required to meet, just as sewage treatment plants and industrial plants have been required to meet over time. So it's not an easy problem to solve either way, but, well, it is not an easy problem to solve either way, let me say that.
A question at the front.
Thank you. My name is John Mattel, Virginia tree farmer, so a type of agriculture. You mentioned economic incentives and legal incentives, and I think it's important to ethical incentives. And now I know that that's hard to measure, and if the cynical among us might say that there's social pressure, but we harvest a lot of timber in Brunswick County, Virginia, and we have the water that comes into our land comes out cleaner than it went in, always. And we're vaguely aware of the rules, but mostly you do it because you think it's the right thing to do, and your neighbors will give you a hard time if you don't. And so I wonder if there's some way to analyze that. I know it's intangible, but I am convinced that most of the water in our forest is clean because we want it to be. It's not because we fear the regulators or that we get money from them. I mean, those things are good. We all love money. I mean, I love it myself. I'm glad to have it. But that's not the main motivator. I don't know if you could comment on that, the use of ethics and peer pressure.
We are economists, so by definition we have trouble with ethics, apparently. But
let me say empirically, by the way, I've done a number of surveys of Maryland farmers. And Maryland farmers do a lot of these conservation practices without getting any subsidies from the government. So there is something of a conservation ethic, and there is something of an ethic at work, very definitely. The problem is that's just has not been enough. Basically, to achieve more, to improve our environment to the quality level we should have, we're just going to have to do more. Now, I think that means recognizing improvements that have been made already, as well as penalizing degradation that has not been penalized before.
Dr. Hendricks comes from a family that has been farming in Kansas at least for a while. So would you like to comment on that issue?
I guess, the only thing I'd say is, there's a lot of heterogeneity. Different people have different opinions towards that of how much they want to do that on a personal, ethical reason. And then probably also some of that peer pressure, I would guess it depends how much the issue is local. There's going to be a lot more of the peer pressure if the environmental impact or the negative impact is local. If I'm doing something that's hurting my neighbor, then there's going to be a lot more of that peer pressure versus if what I'm doing is hurting somebody and I can't even see it, but it's, hundreds of miles down the stream, peer pressure is probably not going to do much there, would be my guess.
Other questions from the audience? Yes, sir.
Lou Pratt, retired federal employee. I guess I'm just curious about the $25,000 fine per day I saw. I mean, you have to be a huge farmer to be able to afford that or very quickly put you out of business. Is that a reasonable fine? If so, who's it applied to?
I mean, I think it's in the statute, that fine. I believe that's written in the regulation. So, I mean, for example, a case that's commonly cited is Duarte, who was a farmer in California. He converted, there was some land he bought and he was putting it into crop production. And so it had not been in crop production since 1988. When he took a plow to it, there were some areas on his field that were vernal pools that they claimed were wetland areas that had that were deemed to have a significant nexus with navigable waters. And so, long story short, he plowed. They sued him for violation. He just settled that case. He settled it for $1.1 million on that field, but he was facing fines of $45 million if he didn't settle. So they settled for all less. They were going to take it longer to try to challenge the WOTUS definition and whether it applied to his wetlands, but gave up and ended up settling the case for $1.1 million. So that's at least one case where I think farmers were facing some pretty stiff fines. But again, a lot of their activities are exempt, though. But that was one case where it was not deemed normal farming activity because it was a conversion of a wetland.
Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Astrid Jacobs from the German Embassy. I'm Minister Counselor for Food and Agriculture. My question is also to Dr. Hendricks. He was explaining that in a market building process, there would be, or environmental interests could play a major role. So my question is, what are these environmental interests? Or who are these environmental interests? Thank you.
Yeah, I think it depends on the situation. I mean, in some cases, it can be a city. It's not even necessarily you can call that environmental water, but I mean, Des Moines, the city of Des Moines Waterworks, they pay a lot to treat their water of nutrients in the water. So they represent an interest that is already collective in some sense. Of what they can pay, they could pay upstream farmers to change practices to reduce nutrient loads, to reduce their costs of treating the water. That has happened in cases like Wichita, Kansas. They're paying farmers upstream to change practices to reduce atrazine runoff into water, because then that atrazine, then they would have to pay for treatment costs in the atrazine for their city water. So they find it less cost to pay farmers to change management practices to not get the atrazine in there in the first place. In other cases, it could be recreational users, or it could be there's a group, Gulf Restoration Network, that represents a lot of different interests in the Gulf of Mexico. So I think there's some of those. In other cases, there aren't institutions currently available, and they would have to come together for some of that.
Yes, sir.
Yes, I'm Larry Stand. I'm a retired radiologist, but a part-time farmer, and I live on the eastern shore of Maryland, where the discussion over pollution of the bay has revolved around nitrogen, phosphorus primarily, okay? There was a long time that everybody said it was the farmer doing the pollution. with these huge plants of the cities dumping in gallons and gallons that wasn't even being monitored. And not only was it not being monitored, but it wasn't being enforced in the endpoint, and leaving the poor farmer to suffer over what was left because he was easy to blame. The question is the EPA enforcing these point sources, which are obviously easy to measure, versus the farmer?
Yes.
Has there been effective
There have been-
enforcement? I mean,
There have been huge upgrades in sewage treatment plants, I know throughout Maryland.
Yeah.
I assume in Virginia as well.
Next question. Gentleman next door.
Thank you. It's been really quite fascinating. My name is Larry Turgino. I'm just, I guess, a public citizen in this discussion. But my observation in question is focused around whether the Farm Bill is really the best effective vehicle for the goals we're trying to achieve with the sort of public policy that you folks have talked to today. And I understand that the world would be a better place if economists were all the elected representatives making public policy. I mean, it's pretty clear here today. But
I think the four of us would worry about that.
nonetheless, I just wonder whether we would not be better off if we focused our public policy debates and issues around interior, commerce, EPA, and other mechanisms of affecting public debate and action on public policies that you're talking about here today, or whether agriculture is really the appropriate and best vehicle by which to do this.
Well, let me ask Dr. Smith to talk a little bit about this issue, because the renewable fuel standards lie with the Environmental Protection Agency, but have significant spillover impacts on the farm sector.
Yeah, I think that's an important point. So in the Farm Bill, less than 1% of the non-nutrition spending in the Farm Bill is in the energy title, which is directed predominantly towards advanced or cellulosic biofuels. And one thing I would say, and in fact did write, is that that's probably not the right place for that spending. You can make good arguments that investment in research and development of new technologies is a good thing for the government to be doing, but you probably want, if you're thinking about developing transportation fuels with low greenhouse gas emissions, you probably want to be running that through an agency that's going to be able to weigh up the costs and benefits of different types of technologies. We're thinking natural gas, thinking electric, thinking all kinds of other potential possibilities, rather than channeling through the Farm Bill, where it is going to be one particular path. So I think that is a very good point. And bigger than that, I mean, 80% of Farm Bill spending is on nutrition, which is essentially completely separate from farming, but it's a political convenience that it works to package those two things together. So I won't pretend to be an expert on how things should be packaged together, but there are, I think, political motivations that sort of are above my pay grade.
Well,
Let me expand on that for a sec, actually. The other thing is that if we think about the environmental issues, there are important roles for the U.S. Department of Agriculture to play in dealing with environmental problems, developing farming methods that actually help reduce environmental damage, conducting demonstration projects to popularize those methods, adapting them for different locations around the country and so on, and then thinking about analyzing which approaches work best and which don't. Agencies like the EPA don't have that kind of technical expertise. If we were going to delegate everything to EPA, then they'd have to develop it, so we'd have to move whole chunks of what's now done by USDA over to EPA, which is what happened when pesticide regulation, for instance, got moved to EPA. But really, That expertise does exist within USDA, in lots of parts of USDA, and in the land grant system that USDA is connected with. And that whole R&D system plays a very important role.
Well, this seems like an opportune time for me to do a little bit of promotion. On Monday, Dr. Philip Pardee, who is, I think without argument, the leading expert on the economics of agricultural research and development and on U.S. agricultural R&D policy in the world, he happens to be from Australia, and I will forgive him that as an English person. He and I will be presenting a paper rolling out a piece on agricultural R&D. And as a taster, when USDA was founded by President Lincoln, so that's 1862, its mission was effectively to be the vehicle through which innovation took place in agriculture. In the 1890s, half of USDA's budget was being spent on that mission of agricultural research and development. Today, it's 1.1%. And so the primary reason for the existence of a USDA was exactly what Erik was talking about a moment ago. And yet we've seen a dramatic change in its focus, really a long way away for the most part from R&D. And so today, for example, the US is not the leading commissioner of publicly funded R&D. China is the leading commissioner. These issues we are going to discuss on Monday at 8:30 when there will be, quote, a free breakfast rather than a free lunch. And if you're interested, we would much like to welcome you to that event, which will also be live streamed. Thank you for coming. Thank you for the interesting questions. Thank you for your patience, because economists are not the most fascinating people. My students tell me that all the time. And it's greatly appreciated. And finally, thank you again, speakers.